600 miles. Now, for many of us, that's no big deal. But let me tell you, folks, in a culture where the fastest mode of transportation was a donkey, it's an eternity. 600 miles. It was the distance between Jerusalem and Babylon. And a whole lot of years before Jesus was born, 587 to be exact, Jerusalem was destroyed, its walls came down, its people carted off in captivity to Babylon, held captive and slaves to the Babylonian army and their king Nebuchadnezzar. Now, historians will tell you that the number of Israelites who were carted off into exile could have ranged in the numbers of tens of thousands. 600 miles from home, in a foreign land, held captive for 48 long years. 48 long years. To their credit, though, the people never gave up on the promise and the hope that their God would come to save them, and one day God did. And it is told, the one that Sarah read in the 40th chapter of Isaiah, a voice cries, "In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." He was coming to save them, to rescue them, to take them home. Their exile was over. And their going home, their journey back to Israel, was one of the definitive events in the whole history of the Jewish people. But I want you to notice something. Did you notice how Mark begins his gospel? See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. I think Mark is using Isaiah 40 to begin his gospel as a way of saying that in Jesus Christ, God is doing the same thing God did 587 years ago, earlier. I think this is the beginning of a new exodus, a new rescue event, maybe the greatest rescue event of them all. I think Mark wants us to know that God has come to rescue even us, to take us finally home. And I think there's not a person in this room who will not agree with this statement. There are an awful lot of ways to spell Babylon. A couple begins to head down the path of divorce because they think it's their only hope. A middle-aged woman attempts suicide because she thinks it's her only way out. A man dies, and his family is left with a very uncertain future. A family's life is put on hold as they await the results of an MRI. A middle-aged man walls off the rest of society because he can't deal with the pain. And folks, the tragedy of all of that is that each of those Babylon experiences and many more have wandered their way through my life in the last 30 days. We know there's different ways to spell Babylon, don't we? All of us are trapped. In 2006, It was Tropical Storm Allison, I believe was the name of it, that dumped 10 inches of rain in one day in Texas. Anybody remember? It's a true story. As the flood waters at a 40-mile-an-hour clip poured into the storm drains in the Houston area, a little girl, you know where I'm going with this, a little girl named Tricia, 7 years old, and her friend were playing by a ditch filled with water. And suddenly she fell in. And the current sucked her right inside that storm drain. Rescue EMTs and police dive teams searched all night long to no avail. The next morning, when everybody had almost given up hope, a city worker who was searching the sewer systems to check on the storm damage, that city worker went over a couple of blocks away and opened up a manhole cover, and with a flashlight in his hand, climbed down into the main sewer drain, and there she was. Shaken, scared, but very much alive. 13 hours after it all began. A voice cries in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." To the people trapped in Babylon, God sent a prophet named Isaiah with a flashlight in his hand down a storm drain to rescue those people and bring them home. 587 years later, God comes again to rescue God's people with one, folks, count them, one very big difference. This time, God didn't send a prophet or a city worker. God came himself in the form of a baby from Bethlehem. With a flashlight in God's hands, God descends into whatever storm drain you and I are in to find us and rescue us and take us home. It's the promise of the gospel. Do you remember last Sunday in her sermon, Vicar Terry asked a really profound question. Remember what it was? Where is your God? Do you want to know the answer to that? In some sense, God's still in the storm drain. Because in some sense, so are we. Amen.